Okay, hello everyone. So then we can start with the next session, and basically with a symposium. And first of all, a very warm welcome to all that are connected to us in the online space also, and here in the in-person audience. And we have the symposium Diversity in Children's Temperaments, Perspective on Shyness in Interaction. And this symposium was organized by Franziska Viertel, by Hilton, Kristie Poole, and Kucker, and myself. And we aim to put a focus on from different disciplinary angles and perspectives on the key dimension of individual differences, namely shyness as one variation of human temperament and as a ubiquitous phenomenon. And with this symposium, we also aim to illustrate the adaptive aspects of shyness and to provide insights into the different manifestations in interactional settings and its impact on empathy, language, and social interactions. And I'm really looking forward to this hybrid event. And briefly, I hand over to my colleague Franziska Viertel, who is present in the online space. She also will say a few words.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Nils, for your introduction. I warmly welcome you from the online space, more precisely from Germany, where it is almost late in the evening. So thanks for the party music in our Zoom room. But back to the content of our symposium. Together, this symposium presents novel methodological approaches as well as new empirical data that challenge the prevailing negative perspective of shyness by providing interactional, behavioral, and experiential patterns of shy children in a multi-dimensional way. But I don't want to anticipate too much, so I'll hand over to you, Nils. You will introduce our first speaker, right?
Yes, so we will have 4 presentations today, and for each talk is the time around 25 minutes. And it's a pleasure to first introduce Sarah Kucker as our first speaker. And she will present a talk about approaches for capturing temperament across children and context. And Sarah Kucker, it's a very pleasure to introduce you. She is an assistant professor of psychology at Oklahoma State University and director of the Language Learning and Development Lab there. And her research examines the mechanisms and processes underlying word learning, categorization, and cognitive development, and with a particular focus on the interaction of individual differences and contextual influences. Sarah Kucker has numerous publications and conference proceedings, and her work highlights individual differences in development, and she is currently PI of a project investigating the mechanisms of language learning in digital media. So, Sarah, it's a pleasure to welcome you in our symposium, and the word is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that welcome introduction, Nils. And thank you both to Franziska and Nils for putting this together. Can everyone back in Toronto hear and see me fine, at least so far?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you are also all seeing that as well. As Nils mentioned, I am currently faculty at Oklahoma State University, but in January of 2023, my lab and I will actually be moving to Southern Methodist University, which is not coincidentally where our colleagues on this project currently are. And as you mentioned, today I'm going to give you an overview of some of the approaches that we can use to capture temperament. And as sort of as a full disclosure, this is going to be a very broad overview. So I'm taking sort of a big picture, how can we capture individual differences, which includes shyness, but it's really going to set the stage for some of our other awesome researchers here to be looking more in depth into shyness. So first I want to start with just this understanding that I think we all know is that children vary a lot. And that variability directly impacts the way that they think, they feel, they behave. I'm probably preaching to the choir here when I say that these differences in temperament are one of the main factors that lead to differences in cognition and the ways that we're going to learn. And so these differences in temperament certainly lead to differences in things like physiological arousal to peer social stress, or being modulated by the context familiarity in word learning. Temperament also might affect attention during word learning and long-term interactions. And so just stay tuned for a little bit more information from our coming talks about the roles that temperament is going to play. My goal here is that the idea is that capturing individual differences and actually including temperament in our research, regardless of what the topic is we study, is really, really important. And those individual differences are really critical for capturing a diversity across different developmental and cognitive trajectories. And to capture temperament, to include temperament in these individual differences in our research, we have traditionally utilized different parent report questionnaires, or oftentimes we use lab-based experimental or behavioral tasks where we might be watching or observing the child in different settings. And so these tasks all are different ways to capture some of these individual differences. But as I'm sure everyone in this audience is aware, these all have some limitations to them. Not only can there be some parent reporting bias when we're asking them to report on their child, but it's often the case where we actually can't get the parent report about the child's temperament. And that's often the case when we might be working with different schools or community groups where the parent might give consent, but having them fill out other paperwork is very limited. We also know that some of these lab tasks can be biased, and As I'm sure many people have experienced, lab tasks can be very tedious. They require long periods of time, maybe very specific contexts or settings. And of course, I'm sure we can all think of a study we did where we didn't collect temperament data, or we don't have measurable differences in individuals. And so these are all different limitations of our current approaches. So the question here really is, what can we do about it? Well, one promising approach is to use naive observers to rate post hoc that child's temperament and get a measure of that child's, in this case, shyness, after the fact. This approach is called thin slice. It's been popularized by Jennifer Tackett, as well as some other individuals. And it provides a way that we can review old videotapes or old files of in this case, children, to judge their personality. However, this thin slice approach, which I'll explain a little bit more here in a minute, has been often limited to older individuals. So it's been used primarily with children who are 3 or older. And as a lot of us probably know, that means we're missing a subset of our population that has individual differences that matter. And in particular, if we're talking things like learning different social skills, or if we're learning language skills, a bulk of that's going to be happening before they're 3. And so right now, we don't have a way of capturing it if we didn't ask the parent for that information at the time that they were participating in the study. Most of these thin slice approaches are limited to certain contexts. And so the work that's been published on this so far has often gone back and coded specific tasks that have elicited different emotions. There may be different social or emotional tasks, and use that. Now, we know those types of settings might lead to certain behaviors that might be easier to capture the temperament personality. But not, especially when thinking about cognition, not all of those tasks are going to elicit all of the behaviors that are relevant for measuring temperament or personality. And so what we did in our current study here is what we really want to do is solve both of those. We want to take a downward extension of that thin slice approach, a way to measure temperament in infants and toddlers, and also see if we can measure temperament when we're doing something that doesn't typically elicit temperamental qualities. In this case, we're looking at cognitive and language tasks that are being done in the lab. And so to do this study, we had a number of participants. This is actually a really large data set that my lab has collected over the last couple of years. Currently, we have 503 children who have videotapes that are long enough that we can thin slice to get the temperament ratings. These are individuals that are between 17 and 47 months old. So we're talking infants and toddlers. They come from a variety of demographic backgrounds and geographic regions in the Midwest, Central, and Southern United States, including both rural and urban areas. Although, to be fair, we do not have a huge variety in ethnic and racial backgrounds. So that is a limitation to this current study. Each of these children completed a series of standard cognitive and language tests in the lab, including some word learning, reference selection, novel noun generalization, and just in social interactions with the experimenter. And so what do we actually do? What is this thin slice thing that we can get a measure of the child's temperament as they're interacting? What we're classifying as thin slice, and what much of the work from Tackett has classified, is multiple slices of video that are rated by naive observers. In our case, we have multiple 3 to 5 minute long slices of the videotape that are rated on a modification of the ECBQ, the Early Child Behavior Questionnaire by Rothbart and colleagues. And we're using the very short form of the ECBQ because that's the same form that our parents collected when they came in for the study. So we can do a direct comparison of the parent report as well as this naive observer report. And so we took the ECBQ and we went through the questions and found the questions that would work for the lab setting. So there are some questions on this questionnaire, if you're familiar with it, that are things like, when on a playground. We don't have a playground in our lab, so we did not include that question, but we ended up with at least half of the questions that could be modified to the lab setting. So things like, when approached by a stranger. We classified the experimenter as the stranger in that case. So it does mirror the ECBQ. Again, this is similar to what Tackett has done for some of her studies. And here we're going to be capturing just the broad domains of negative affect, certainty, and effortful control, because the very short form of the ECBQ, those are the 3 domains that it captures. So again, I'm not going to be talking about shyness specifically, but I'll be talking about negative affect, which is the overall domain in which it is housed. And so we end up with a composite score across these three different slices of video. The first 3 minutes, which is when the child is first arriving to the experiment room, meeting the experimenter for the first time, sort of getting situated. A middle 5 minutes of their entire session. The whole session lasted anywhere between 30 minutes and an hour, depending on the child. So middle 5 minutes where there was a free play, where they might have interacted with the experimenter. And then the end 5 minutes where there was typically a semi-structured task, where we ask the child to follow specific directions. I'll give you a short view of sort of what this looks like here. And hopefully, if you can't hear the volume, that's okay. I'm going to narrate it a little bit. So the first 5 minutes, where they're getting warmed up, meeting the experimenter. Is this slice 2? Where they're just free play, interacting with both familiar and novel toys. And here's slice 3. Semi-structured task. So those are 3 snapshots of what the session looked like. You see sort of getting used to it, free play in the middle, and then the semi-structured task. That was after actually our novel noun generalization task, which I'll come back here in a second. And at each section, the naive observers would rate the child's temperament, and then we would average those 3 together to get an overall score for the child. So here's the $1 million question. Does it work? Can we actually accurately capture the child's temperament using this approach so we can get then a sense of the child's temperament and shyness in a variety of different test settings? To sort of prove that it works for you, I'm going to give you 3 pieces of information. This is just pilot data currently. I'm going to share with you some of the inter-rater reliability. We had 2 coders that independently rated a random subset. So about 50% of these videos were coded by 2 individuals. I'm also going to show you the convergent validity, and this will be the thin slice ratings by the observers compared to the parent reported ratings using the ECBQ. And then also the criterion validity. This is going to be comparing the thin slice ratings by the observers to the parent reported vocabulary. And we're using vocabulary here as our criterion, a measure of does temperament actually predict some of these real world outcomes? Because we know that temperament does relate to language skills. And this is following up on some of the other work that my lab has done, including many of people, including people in this room, have done looking that vocabulary is correlated with temperament. Negative affect is negatively correlated with vocabulary. Certainty and effortful control are positively correlated. And so we're going to hope that if we use our thin slice ratings instead of parent report, we'd see the same pattern here. So let's break these down and look at it one at a time. What do we see for inter-rater reliability? If we have 2 research assistants that are both naive to what the child's temperament actually is, independently rate using the thin slice approach, do they agree? Can they come to the same conclusion? And looking across the 3 domains of temperament, we see very high inter-rater reliability. By most classifications, these are very good to excellent interclass correlations. And so it doesn't matter if these raters are rating negative affect, if they're rating urgency or effort for control, they're in high agreement. So this is great. That means that we can take naive observers. This is with minimal training. These research assistants practiced on a separate subset of 3 to 5 videos, and that is it. So it's very easy for them to pick it up, and they're very reliable. What about convergent validity? So how do we take our thin slice ratings? How do those compare to the parent reported ratings? We see, again, significant correlations between each of the domains of temperament. So the thin slice rating from the naive observers is significantly correlated with the parent report. Now, these correlations do match up with that by Tackett and colleagues who have done it with older preschool kids as well as adolescents. So our thin slice with these younger infants and toddlers is working just as well as the prior work on thin slice. Another good sign, right? Our third question is about criterion validity. Do these ratings of thin slice, can they also predict vocabulary in the same way that parent reported temperament predicts vocabulary? And again, we see significant correlations with all three domains, a negative correlation with negative affect and a positive correlations with certainty and effortful control. So this gives us more evidence that the thin slice does seem to be a valid approach for capturing children's temperament, even when it's just a cognitive lab task in a variety of different settings. But another important question that is both relevant for the criterion validity, does the thin slice rating predict real world outcomes, but is also in itself just an inherently important question of, can thin slice predict performance on a lab-based task? We can look at how did they perform on these various tasks that we did in the lab. And so I'll very quickly show you some of that. And these children, they did actually a subset of tasks. Every child did at least 1 or 2 tasks, somewhere up to 5 or 6, just depending on the semester and the other projects that we had going on. But every child, or most children, completed what we call our warm-up task, or our known reference selection familiar item, where they're given 3 different objects and we ask them just to pick one of them. So can you get the cup in this case? And so we can look at the correlations of their temperament with their ability to get the cup when they're asked to get it. And what you see here, these are just the R values of the correlations between the negative affect, certainty, and effortful control. All 3 predict their ability to get the cup, and in very similar patterns as to what we saw with the overall vocabulary, which makes sense. This is a lab task of the vocabulary that parents are reporting on. But this is great. Everything is correlating, right? So thin slice is good. Temperament is clearly mattering in this case. To give you just a comparison, here's the parent reported temperament. And so thin slice on top is showing you the observer rated temperament correlations, and the bottom table here is showing you parent reported temperament. Another task we do is a familiar reference selection, or a known reference selection, where we have familiar and novel items. So this is a lot like the familiar task, except for we have this novel distractor item. That's, you can see the colorful thing in the ball-like thing in the middle. So there's a distractor item. So you can imagine that children of different temperaments are going to react differently to that. And again, we see correlations with temperament according to both the thin slice method, and you see correlations with effortful control in the parent report. And I actually do have some ideas about why we don't see perfect correlation between thin slice and parent report in this case, and I'm happy to talk about those a little bit later. We also do a novel reference selection. We ask them to find the novel thing. We say, where's the yuck? And they have to figure out on their own which one it is. So this is sort of a standard task in word learning or word mapping. And we find that novel reference selection is predicted by effortful control, but not so much the others. And this is actually consistent with some prior work by some of the people in this symposium. After children complete these, we actually test their retention. Can they remember what the yuck was? Do they remember any of these novel objects? And so we can look at temperament predicting those. Again, we see effortful control is pulling out, which is really interesting, suggesting that maybe things like shyness may not matter as much for retention, but things like patience and organization and this control element, executive function skills, those might. And the last test we did is a generalization task where we give a child an object, we say, this is my ZUP, and then we ask the child, can you get your ZUP? This is the one you saw in the video clip that I showed you. And as adults, you're probably looking at this and saying, okay, well, if the top item is a ZUP, the other item must be this purple thing that looks like it, that has the same shape to it. This is the classic novel noun generalization task. It's testing for children's shape bias. In this case, and it takes usually until kids are at least around 2 before they can generalize in this fashion. But we can look at correlations between this task and temperament. Again, effortful control very consistently across thin slice and parent report is predicting it. And the others do seem to have some predictive power depending on who you're asking. And so this is sort of one of our avenues of follow-up work. So if we take this all together, what this suggests is that thin slice may offer a novel, very ecologically valid approach for capturing a diversity in children's temperament especially during these interactive tasks with a stranger. And it offers us a method for incorporating temperament across diversity of contexts, a diversity of ranges, ages, and children. And so we can start to actually incorporate these differences in more of the work that we're doing, instead of being limited to times where we purposely, a priori, plan to collect it or did it in a systematic way to get temperament information. So temperament matters, as you'll see today. Shyness in particular is going to influence a lot of things. And having good methods to actually capture that is going to be the one of the best ways that we can move forward in our research to get a more holistic picture of individual differences and how they're influencing our cognition and our development across time. So many thanks to lots of people. Like I said, this data has come from multiple different labs. And here's some of my current lab mates, as well as all the individuals and families who have participated and contributed to this sort of massive data set that we have. So thank you.
So thank you very much, Sarah, for your great talk. And so we have time for questions. And if you have questions here in the in-person audience, you can step in front of the microphone that we can see you and hear you. And also, of course, feel free to enter questions into the chat. So Franziska Viertel will also monitor these questions there. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Sarah. Can you see who's asking?
I cannot see who's asking, but I can hear
Matt.
you.
Hi.
Hi, recognize your voice.
Obviously a very nice talk. I really was interested in the findings and the work. I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about what aspect of the task you think temperament is modulating here. So is it at the response level? Is it at the attentional level? Where is this coming in? And does it differ according to the task that you're using?
Yeah, I think temperament does matter based on the task. So we know that behavior is a result of these individual differences they're coming to the task with, as well as the context in which they're sitting. I think the task that we see correlations between the parent report and the thin slice, like a familiar trials, those are based on prior knowledge, the knowledge that they're bringing in with. And so things like just their prior experience of using language, we know that shyness is going to matter there, right? So that's where we see negative affect might matter. That's where we know that effortful control, urgency, all those things matter. But in tasks where there's novel objects present, such as the know and reference selection, where there's both familiar and novel distractors, and they have to ignore the novel distractor to get the familiar item, how you manage that context is going to matter a whole lot more. And so that's where I think we actually see differences between the thin slice and the parent report, because in the moment context, that is what the thin slice is capturing best. And so things like effortful control, executive function skills, ability to perseverate and change your attention is going to matter more for that task than perhaps your prior knowledge of what words and objects go together. Whereas the parent report might give us a better measure of that overall vocabulary that might be better for tasks that are all familiar objects or asking the children to draw on their prior knowledge. And so I think it's modulating in different ways based on how the context is there. And I do think there's some really cool things looking at how thin slice might give us slightly different information than what the parent report is giving us. That may be better suited for some tasks over others as well. And so that's where we sort of want to move forward, is what are the best circumstances to use this as a tool? And the key is that we can start to capture individual differences in a wider variety of tasks and settings.
Yeah, thank you. You might not have seen, but I was nodding very enthusiastically for your response. That was really cool. Thanks.
So, more questions? Maybe we have also some questions in the chat, Franziska?
No, unfortunately not. There aren't any questions here.
As we're sort of waiting, I should add that because this is sort of broad domains, and we're not actually looking at shyness in particular, that's one of the next steps, is to take the ECBQ and expand it out to make a modified form that is a longer version, so we can actually get to some of those subdomains. And so I know that that's where it sort of sets the stage for being able to look at more specific elements of temperament and behavior. And this is just the first step.
Okay, then thank you very much, Sarah, for your great, interesting talk. So feel free also to enter questions in the chat after each talk, so we can also have the opportunity to answer them later. So we will continue with our next speaker, that is Kristie Poole. And while Kristie is setting up the presentation, I can took the chance and introduce her. So Kristie Poole is a a postdoctoral fellow in the Social Development Lab at the University of Waterloo. And her research examines how individual differences in temperamental shyness are related to social and emotional development. And her research takes a multi-method developmental approach to better understand the origins, heterogeneity, and outcomes of shyness. And she has received multiple national and international recognitions for her research and has published in leading journals in the field of child development. So it's a pleasure to hear your talk, and the stage is yours.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. So as mentioned, my name is Kristie Poole, and I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Waterloo, working with Heather Henderson. And today I'll be presenting on some of the work that we've been doing, looking at how children's shyness is related to physiological arousal in the context of a peer's social stress. So when we're talking about shyness, what we're talking about is a trait that's characterized by fear, nervousness, and self-consciousness in new social situations. So for example, this could be meeting somebody new or being the center of attention, for example, giving a speech in front of an audience. And previous work has shown that shy children, when they're in these situations, are more likely to perceive and detect threat. So one study that I really like by Lapou and Perez Edgar that's illustrated here is showing that shy children have this bias for detecting threat, specifically when they're in a social context, and this is not generalizable to non-social contexts. So the take-home point here is that shy children, or shy people in general, really are detecting threat in social contexts. So a body of work has examined anxiety-related responses among shy individuals as they are encountering these potentially threatening social situations. So for example, when they're meeting somebody new or giving a speech. And collectively, what this work has found is that shyness tends to be related to different indices of anxiety across many different levels. So for example, shyness tends to be correlated with physiological arousal during these social stressors. So for example, experiencing an increase in heart rate. Shyness is also related to affective responses. So we typically measure this by looking at self-report of nervousness or fear during these social situations. And shyness is also related to behavioral manifestations of anxiety. So for example, gaze aversion or avoidance-related behaviors, such as reducing the amount of talking that maybe you're doing in a situation. So although that we know that shyness is related to these different indices of personal anxiety, that is anxiety when you yourself are engaging in the social situation, we know relatively little about how shyness is related to empathic or vicarious anxiety. So when I'm talking about empathic anxiety, I'm talking about anxiety that is experienced on behalf of somebody else. So some of you maybe have experienced this yourself, but it could be if you were watching somebody else give a speech, it might elicit feelings of anxiety in you as the observer. And empathic anxiety is particularly important to study for shy children because shy children are often described by their peers as being less empathetic. And laboratory studies have also shown that shy children tend to display fewer empathic behaviors, for example, towards an experimenter who pretends to hurt her finger. Despite this inverse relation that's been found between shyness and empathy, it's been hypothesized that shy children may generate fewer empathic behaviors because they're experiencing anxiety and inhibition in these contexts that are requiring them to act empathically. So they're experiencing fear, which is impeding the empathic behavior, rather than actually lacking any feelings of empathy in these situations. So in the current study, as I'll present, we're particularly interested in examining changes in heart rate as a physiological index of physiological arousal. So, and we'll be examining it specifically in the context of a peer delivering a speech. And I'll give you a bit more detail in the upcoming slides. Okay. So the first research question is to examine whether or not shyness is related to changes in heart rate while the child is anticipating a peer give a speech. The second research question is then to examine if the level of anxious behavior that the presenting peer is displaying modulates the relation between the observing child's level of shyness and further changes in their heart rate as they watch their peer give the speech. So for the first question, we hypothesized that the observing child shyness would be related to increases in physiological arousal while they were anticipating their peer having to give a speech. However, we expected that this level of physiological arousal would be dependent on the amount of anxious behavior that the peer actually displayed when they were giving the speech. Specifically, if the presenting peer displayed high levels of anxious behavior, we predicted that the observing child's shyness would be related to further increases in their own physiological arousal. However, if the presenting peer showed low levels of anxious behavior, we predicted that the observing child's shyness would be related to decreases in physiological arousal. So to do this study, we used a sample of 62 children who were between the ages of 9 and 11. The participants were from the community in Waterloo, Ontario in Canada. And data collection began in late 2018 and it ended in early 2020, which, as you can probably tell by the date, was due to the pandemic. So the sample size is a bit smaller than what we would like, but just keep that in mind as I present the results. So for this study, children engaged in 2 separate laboratory visits. The first was an individual study visit. So during this visit, as part of the larger study, the child came to the laboratory with their caregiver and engaged in various independent tasks, including the completion of questionnaires. And of course, of particular interest to this study was the child's self-report of their temperamental shyness, which was assessed using the early adolescent temperament questionnaire. Children also returned to the laboratory for a dyadic study visit. And during this visit, children were randomly paired with another child from the study who they had never met, who was the same age and the same sex. And during this dyadic visit, the 2 children engaged in various structured and unstructured tasks, including the speech task, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And for the duration of the study visit, children were equipped with a portable ECG unit so that we could look at their heart rate across different tasks during this study visit. Okay, so before introducing the 2 unfamiliar members of the dyad, we first collected the children's baseline physiology. So this was before they met the child and they were just sitting at a table watching an emotionally neutral video. And we wanted to do this to kind of get their resting or baseline heart rate in the absence of any possible social threat. Next, the children met and they were told that they would have to engage in a speech task. And so one thing that I just wanted to note here is that both children did end up doing the speech task and the order was randomly assigned. So in this particular case, the child on the right with the pen and the paper is the presenting, will be the presenting child, and the one on the left is the observing child. So the first component of the speech task is this preparation period. So the experimenter tells the presenting child that soon they will have to give a speech, and the speech must be 5 minutes long, and they should talk about good and bad things about themselves. And they're also told that this speech would be video recorded and shown to other kids who would later come into the laboratory. And this is to kind of amp up the amount of social evaluative stress that the child might feel. And as you can see in this picture, the non-presenting or the observing child sat across the table from the presenting peer during this preparation or anticipation period. So after the preparation period, The experimenter returned to the room and asked the presenting child to stand on a designated spot to start their speech delivery. So you can see here it's the child with the green shorts, and the child with the blue shorts is the observing child. So in addition to the observing child being in the audience, there were also 2 more chairs, one with the experimenter and then another unfamiliar research assistant, as well as a video camera. So again, this is to induce higher levels of social stress. And so across these 3 phases, we collected or we extracted the observing child's heart rate, which was used in our analysis. So again, this is the heart rate from the child that is in the black and gray t-shirt. In addition to this, we also coded the anxious behavior of the child who was presenting. So this included the proportion of time that the child spent speaking, the level of verbal anxiety they displayed, such as stuttering or stumbling over their words, and the level of physical anxiety that they displayed, for example, avoiding eye contact with the audience. And these 3 variables were highly related, and so we combined them into an anxious behavior composite, which was used in our analyses. Okay, so just before I present the results, I want to kind of orient you to this figure. So what do we have along the x-axis are those 3 phases of the speech task, including the baseline period. And then on the y-axis, we have the observing child's heart rate. And so when I present the results, you'll see a line come up, and this is illustrating the direction of the relation between the observing child's shyness and their changes in heart rate across the different task phases. So as a reminder, our first question is to see if the observing child's shyness is related to changes in heart rate from the baseline period to the peer's speech preparation period. And in line with our hypothesis, what we found is that the observing child's shyness was related to increases in their heart rate while they were sitting across from the other child who was preparing his or her speech. Next, we tested if this pattern of physiological arousal during the preparation period was moderated by the level of anxious behavior that the presenting child actually displayed during the speech. And in line with our hypothesis, we found that further changes in heart rate was dependent on the presenting child's level of anxious behavior. Specifically, if the presenting child showed high levels of anxious behavior, the observing child's shyness was related to further increases in their own heart rate during the peer's speech delivery. However, if the presenting child showed low levels of anxious behavior, the observing child's shyness was actually related to decreases in their own heart rate during the speech delivery. And one thing I just wanted to note is that the findings that I presented here were independent of presentation order, meaning that going first versus second actually didn't influence the relation between shyness and changes in heart rate across the tasks. Okay, so just to summarize, what we found is that children's shyness was related to physiological arousal while a peer prepared his or her speech. But this arousal was sensitive to the amount of anxious behavior that the child displayed while they were delivering the speech. So as I kind of mentioned earlier in the talk, previous work has shown evidence that shyness is related to increases during the anticipation of one's own social stressor, such as delivering a speech. And our preliminary results may suggest that children's shyness is also related to increases in heart rate in the context of a peer's anticipation period. And because the context in the current study was likely personally relevant for shy children due to their own fears related to social evaluation and feelings of self-consciousness, we suspect that they are more easily able to imagine themselves in this social situation, which consequently may result in feelings of nervousness and corresponding increases in physiological arousal. So it's possible that due to their own social concerns, shy children may have imagined a relatively poor outcome for themselves if they were in this situation, and therefore generalize this hypothesis to the peer who is sitting across from them, resulting in physiological arousal for the observing child. However, the kind of exciting thing, I think, is that this pattern of arousal during the anticipation period was moderated by the level of anxious behavior that the presenting peer displayed. So although we didn't assess social learning per se in the current study, our pattern of findings may provide some preliminary evidence that the observation of a peer's social success or difficulty may indeed shape the level of arousal in children around them or people around them. And one interpretation of the finding of increases in heart rate for shy children in the context of a visibly anxious peer is that observing an anxious peer may elicit feelings of empathic or vicarious anxiety. In contrast, observing a non-anxious peer may have allowed the shy child to learn that the task and environment was not actually threatening and facilitated a decrease in their heart rate, which is consistent with a physiological profile of recovery and an attempt to return to more of a calm baseline physiological state. And this finding that shy children do tend to experience interpersonal regulation may have implications in a school context. So, for example, it may be beneficial to pair shy children with non-anxious peers during potentially threatening social situations, for example, class presentations or science fairs. And then finally, our findings also have implications for understanding empathy-related processes among shy children. So as I noted earlier, there tends to be this inverse relation between shyness and empathy. That is, the more shy a child is, the less empathic behaviors that they might display. But we think that this is related to anxiety-related performance deficits in actually generating these behaviors, as opposed to any competence deficits in feeling or experiencing empathy. And one kind of unique aspect of this study is that we assessed a physiological correlate of empathic anxiety, which presumably does not require any performance efforts from the child, given the automatic nature of physiological processes. And so our pattern of findings may suggest that shy children are indeed able to recognize, understand, and feel the emotional state of a peer, at least in the context of social stress. And just to kind of end off, I wanted to illustrate some limitations that we're aware of in the current study, which I think kind of tell us some important future directions. So first, we specifically examined children's changes in heart rate to index physiological arousal. And I think a really interesting and important future direction is to also collect the observing child's self-reported nervousness in order to see if there's further evidence on an affective level to support the notion of they might be experiencing empathic anxiety. Second, as I mentioned earlier, our data collection was terminated prematurely due to the pandemic, and so it's really important for future studies to further replicate what we found in the current study using larger sample sizes. Finally, in the current study, children were paired with unfamiliar peers. And I think an interesting avenue for future research is to examine if shy children's arousal is heightened or diminished in the context of familiar peers, such as maybe their friends or their siblings. And with that, I would just like to acknowledge the funding that helped to support my research, members of the Social Development Lab for their help with data collection and coding, as well as all of the children for participating in the study. And thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, Kristie, for your interesting talk. So we have time for questions from the audience. So we are perfectly in time. So please feel free to ask your questions. So maybe, yeah.
Hi, it was a really interesting talk, and I don't know much about empathy, but what I was thinking of was also like maybe are there mirror neurons maybe connected to this? Because I was thinking of it because he said it hadn't that shy children did show that they were not kind of having this empathy, but that you said it had nothing to do with their actual performance being able to do so. So I was actually wondering if mirror neurons would be connected to this. Would the heart rate go up if you see somebody else doing this talk? Would that already be connected to it, or is that actually a totally completely different research thing?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really wonderful question. I'll say I'm not an expert in mirror neurons, so I can't quite speak to it. But there are other tasks that researchers have done to try and capture maybe like emotional contagion or these like empathic processes. So for example, looking at if I smile, does that elicit a smile in you type of thing? And one of my colleagues, Tegan McGowan, she recently published a study looking at how shyness in children is related to automatic imitation, which is thought to be governed by mirror neurons. And interestingly, she found that shyness was actually related to more automatic imitation, which suggests that they do have intact processes that we think underlie empathy.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So do we have another questions, maybe also from the chat? Go ahead, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the lovely talk. I was wanting to ask you a question about what this heart rate is really reflecting. So what do you think is going on there? Could it be that in this situation, the shy kids, they want to help, but they're distressed that they don't feel like they can, and that's what this heart rate increase is reflecting? Or is it just reflecting that they're feeling anxiety reflected back at them? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So the way that I interpreted obviously was for feelings of anxiety. And one of the downsides of physiology is that we never actually know what it's capturing. So other work has found that increases in heart rate may happen during exciting times or maybe when you're looking forward to something. But I think your idea about like the physiology because they want to help the other child is a really interesting one. And I think future work could maybe probe the cognitions of children afterwards to say, you know, did you want to help the other child, or actually code any manifestations of helping behavior in that context or in other contexts.
Yeah, cool, thank you.
So do we have another question? Otherwise, I would take the opportunity and follow up on Matt's question.
Yeah.
So during your talk, I was thinking about the phenomenon of social referencing, so that especially young children attend to their mother or their father to interpret the ongoing situation. So that might be an explanation that would be reflected in the physiological heart rate. So do you have thought about that on connecting your findings with the phenomenon of social referencing?
Yeah, I've never personally thought about that in the context of this study, but I think it could be kind of interpreted similarly to the social learning explanation that I kind of highlighted. So, you know, maybe the shy child's experiencing this physiological arousal, and then they're referencing the other peer who is displaying either maybe socially competent or socially anxious, and this is sort of shaping their possibly cognitions related to the situation.
Thank you. So, Franziska, do we have further questions in the online chat?
No, not yet, but I would be glad to pose one by myself. One last question. I was interested, did you distinguish between negative and positive behavioral signs of shyness during the child's presentation or his or her speech delivery? My idea was that when children see that an obviously shy child can regulate her emotion quite positively, the arousal of the watching child could be reduced compared to watching a child that regulates her emotion in a negative way?
What an awesome question. I love that question a lot. Obviously, I'm very interested in that line of research. In the current study, we did not code for positive and non-positive expressions of shyness. We just coded for more global levels of anxious behavior. But I definitely think that's an interesting hypothesis to kind of see if the child's own arousal differs based on what we think is the more adaptive or non-adaptive way of regulating arousal among shy children. So unfortunately, we didn't look at that, but I think that would be a very cool question in the future to address.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, let's thank the speaker again. And so our next talk would be Matt Hilton. And Matt Hilton is a postdoctoral researcher in the Interdisciplinary Research Unit, Crossing the Borders, funded by the German Research Foundation. And he is based at the University of Potsdam in Germany, and his work aims to specify the cognitive processes that underlie language development and action understanding during infancy and early childhood. And he is an expert on individual differences in early word learning, and his publications emphasize the value of research that draws together findings from different disciplinary boundaries. So, Matt, the stage is yours.
Thank you. I hope that I can be heard. This is a very nice, relaxing atmosphere so far, which is usually when things go wrong. So I have to try and keep my attention focused. Today I'll be talking about shyness and word learning and interrelations between those two phenomena. And I'll jump right in by walking you through my working definition of shyness today. So I'm taking shyness as a biologically based, enduring individual difference. So a subscale of temperament, the theme of the symposium, and specifically this shyness manifests as a discomfort or inhibition in novel social situations, which is related to an aversion to novelty more generally. And taking this definition, this means that you can measure and record shyness in very young children very early in development. So when I'm talking about shyness throughout the talk today, I'm using this sort of working definition of where this is coming from. And thinking about the link between shyness and language, the link we know is self-evident and exists. So if we take, for example, a broad example, do a corpus-based analysis, this is of British English, of the 3 adjectives that most often co-occur alongside the adjective shy. The third adjective that occurs most often is awkward, which I think says a lot about how we think about shyness as a society, which isn't a theme of this symposium or talk. The second most co-occurring adjective is timid, but by far the most co-occurring adjective that occurs with shy is the adjective quiet. So we know from our everyday existence, it seems to be somewhat self-evident that shyness is linked to a reduction in vocalizations, a reduction in language production. And the aim of my work in this area is to really probe into, okay, are these effects purely at the production level, or do these effects go deeper, and is there a link between shyness and the cognitive processes by which language is acquired? So I look at this then in the very earliest stages of language development, or an early stage of language development from about the age of 2. And the processes that I'm particularly interested in, Sarah already spoke about in our first session a little bit, touched on. I'm interested in these fast mapping, mutual exclusivity, reference selection style tasks, which are fairly simple to grasp. What you'll do is from the age of 2, if you present a child with these 3 objects, so it's important that 2 of those objects are familiar and 1 of those objects is novel. If you then ask the child for the blicket, so if you ask for a novel word, the child will select that novel object as the referent of that novel word. So in the moment that you ask them, they can very quickly work out, okay, I've never heard this word blicket before, this is a new word. The word blicket must refer to the novel object that's in the middle here and select that. And we can say here, during this trial, they formed a word-object association between the word blicket and this novel object, one of which I also saw in one of the videos in the first talk, which was nice. So these blickets live on in various different labs. The extent to which these processes are involved in retention and language learning is a topic for another talk, and maybe we can go into that if we have time at the end. But certainly here I'm just interested in this in the moment working out what a word means. And so the first idea we had in the lab was to see whether shyness could predict children's performance on a task that measures this ability. So we took children at 24 months old. This should be the age at which this behavior is robust, very easily measurable, recordable. And for each child, we did a standard reference selection fast mapping task and took a shyness score for each child. This shyness score is based on the shyness scale from the Early Childhood Behavior Questionnaire from Putnam and colleagues. This is one of the Rothbard questionnaires. And it's 12 items, and the parent rates from 1 to 7 how often over the last 2 weeks their child has demonstrated shy type behaviors. So when you average across these, you get a score between 1 and 7. A score of 1 means that child is the least possible shy, and a score of 7 means that the child is the most possible shy. And this measure of shyness is how I measure shyness for every study I'm going to talk about in this talk. So always going back to this Early Childhood Behavior Questionnaire scale between 1 and 7. And what we found in this initial study was a significant negative correlation between shyness and the proportion of trials on which the child will select that novel object as the referent of the novel label. So in other words, the shyer children were less likely to choose that blue novel object when I asked them to hand me the Blicket. And this task is a tabletop lab-based task in which the child is sat opposite the experimenter and is having to respond to each question. Where's the Blicket? Where's the Cobra? And so on. So the obvious criticism here is, okay, this might just still be a performance-based issue, so the shy children have no problems working out which one is the Blicket. They know full well that the object in the middle is the Blicket, but they have problems then responding in the moment. So we're still working at the performance level here. So in a follow-up study, what we did was we took out this social component, we took out the need for any responses, and presented it as a screen-based eye tracking study. So the child sits on their parent's lap in front of a computer screen with an eye tracker. We record the child's gaze, and if this works with the video, on each trial we present images of the objects, and we just record where the child is looking while one of those objects is labeled. So there's no audio on this video, but while these objects are on the screen, the children hear something like, wow, look, it's a Blicket. Can you see the Blicket? Wow, there's the Blicket, before they disappear. And what we're doing is recording at which object the child is looking following the onset of the word Blicket for the first time. And what we found was, again, a significant negative correlation between shyness and looking to the target object. So this means that shyer children are looking less at that novel object when they are hearing the word Blicket, for example. So even when there's no response needed, it seems that shyness is somehow involved in the attentional processes that are underlying children's performance on this task. So it seems to go a bit deeper than just affecting the performance level. So the study that I want to present today tries to build on this and ask, okay, if shyness is a discomfort or inhibition in novel social situations, can we somehow experimentally manipulate how familiar the task is for the children, and then examine if that affects how children are dividing their attention across the objects when they're doing this eye tracking task. So the study I'll present today, so it's worth saying the 2 previous studies I've just presented were testing English-speaking children growing up in England. Now we're testing German-speaking children growing up in Germany. So it was a different lab that this is being run in. And these children are slightly older than the samples that I've presented to you previously. So that's something that's really worth keeping in mind. But these are monolingual kids. They were tested in the lab, and they're all typically developing in sample at the time we tested. And the procedure is exactly the same as the eye tracking task that I just presented to you. So the child sits on their parent's lap in front of a computer screen, and they're presented with a series of trials. On every trial they see 2 familiar objects and 1 novel object, and they hear a carrier phrase like, look, there's a Blicket, can you see the Blicket? Wow, a Blicket. And during these trials, we're recording where the child is looking across this object array. So because we wanted to manipulate how familiar the context of this task is while not affecting the task itself, we assigned children to one of two conditions. In the first condition, our familiar context condition, we ran it as we would run any lab study. So the experimenter welcomes the child to the lab. The experimenter spends some time playing with the child in the waiting room, getting to know the child. And then the experimenter, the child, and the parent all sit in front of the computer screen and watch a video of the experimenter reading a storybook for 5 minutes. And the idea here is that we want to get the children very familiar with seeing this experimenter on the screen and also hearing the experimenter's voice coming through the computer speakers. Once this part of the task is over, the experimenter moves back behind the curtain to start running the tech and to start the eye tracking part of the experiment. And then a fairly standard eye tracking experiment commences. The only difference from the previous study I showed you is that at the beginning of the study, there's a video of the experimenter that the child just met, waving at them and welcoming them to the task. And during the labeling on the trials, the children are hearing the voice of this familiar experimenter. The rest is the same as I've just showed, a series of trials, 2 familiar objects and 1 novel object. So an experiment would look like this. The first thing the child sees at the start of the experiment is the familiar experimenter greeting them to the task in a video, and then trial 1, trial 2, so worth saying that each trial is a different set of objects, always 2 familiar, 1 novel. And then every third trial, our experimenter appears again in video form just to really drive home that the voice these children are hearing belongs to the experimenter that they've just met and become very familiar with at the start of the experiment. You might predict where it's going. In the second condition, in our unfamiliar context, everything that happens up to the point of the experiment beginning is identical to the first condition I've just shown you. But then, when the experiment begins, the experimenter's gone behind the curtain, the experimenter that appears on the screen is a stranger to the child, so it's a completely unfamiliar adult. And the voice that is labeling the objects during the task is the voice of this unfamiliar experimenter. So suddenly the experiment begins and there's an unfamiliar person on the screen and there's an unfamiliar voice coming through the speakers. And this is how we try to manipulate the familiarity of the task. And this very complicated slide is just to explain that we had 2 experimenters running the study, so we could fully counterbalance within groups which experimenter was the familiar experimenter and which experimenter was the novel experimenter that suddenly appears on the screen. So this isn't going to be anything to do with experimenter effects of who's doing the labeling. Everything was completely counterbalanced across these kids. The final thing to go through before I can show you my results is that we also had 2 different trial types. On one trial, as is fairly standard, we presented known labels to see how children are looking across the array when they're hearing a label that they already have a mapping for. And then on 4 trials, we're looking at where children are looking when they hear the novel label, so how they're looking when they're forming a new object label mapping. And the analysis, we look at how long the child is looking at each of the objects, and then we work out a proportion of time looking at the target object relative to all objects. So on novel label trials, the novel object is the target. On known label trials, the label that the object that label's referring to is our target. I log transform this and feed it into a 3 fixed factor linear mixed effects model, which breaks all of our brains at this point, but I'll try my best to lead you through it. What we see is that we have 2 significant rows here. We have a significant fixed effect and we have a significant interaction. Our significant fixed effect is of label type. And what this means is that when children are hearing a known label, they are looking much more at the target than when they hear a novel label, which makes sense, I think, to me, because if they are hearing a known label, they've already formed that mapping. They hear the word cart, they can look straight at the car. When they're hearing a novel label, for example, Blicket, this involves working out then what that means. So you're going to have to look across all objects at some point to then work out which one isn't the Blicket, to then focus your attention on the Blicket. So this is why we see such a big difference between looking on known label trials and novel label trials. And then, as if our brains haven't had to work hard enough, we get a significant three-way interaction. So we just need to like breathe deep, and we'll get through the next slide where I try and unpick this for you. Our significant three-way interaction is then between label type, so whether they're hearing a known or a novel label, condition, so whether it's the familiar context or the unfamiliar context, and their shyness score, which here is zero-centered. If I split the relation between shyness and proportion of looking to the target for all of our 4 panels, what we can see in the top half of this is that we don't find any relation between shyness and looking to the target when the label is known. So when they're hearing the word car, there's no difference, or there's no link between looking to the target and their shyness. But in this bottom panel and in this bottom left panel, what we're seeing is that when the context is familiar, shyness is now positively related to looking to the target. So if we zoom in on this bottom left panel, what we see is that by familiarizing the children with the task, trying to boost the familiarity of the context in which the task is presented, even though the task is exactly the same across the 2 conditions in terms of the trials, we're boosting shyer children's attention to the target, completely in contrast to previous work where we always find that shyness is negatively related to performance on these tasks. It seems that by adapting the environment of the task, we can really allow these shy children to perform in a way that we wouldn't expect based on the previous tasks. But also worth saying, in the bottom right panel, we don't then see any relation between shyness and target looking in our unfamiliar context when they're hearing a novel label. So we got through it, and we can be proud of ourselves for that. The take-home messages that I have from this study is that familiarizing the context doesn't seem to just have, so my everyday expectation would be if you familiarize the context, you're going to allow shyer children to respond better, and it will again be at the response level. It seems that if you're doing things to the environment to make it more familiar, you're also allowing children's cognitive processing, their attentional processing, to then perform differently too. And again, this is another study in a series of studies that we've got that are showing that shyness is related to attentional processing on these reference selection fast mapping tasks. So shyness goes a bit deeper at this young age in driving differences in attentional processing during the earliest stages of word learning, and this is something really important to think about. And this is a very small part of a very large puzzle, but we're going in the direction of really taking shyness seriously and explaining why shyness must be taken seriously as a factor in early language development. And with that, I'm finished, and thank those that ran the study, the Baby Lab team, and all the families that took part, and open up for questions. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Matt, for the interesting talk. We have now time for questions. So, feel free to ask Matt or enter questions in the chat.
I have a question online. I don't think you can see me, but you can probably hear me.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. So this is Sarah Kucker. This is very fascinating work about how the familiarity, in this case of the people, is changing the way that the children are interacting. I'd love to hear your thoughts about changing the familiarity or the features of the objects themselves. So if children get a chance to play with the objects, are they less sort of scary at that, and especially for those shy children, or the differences between the 2D and 3D objects? And just your thoughts about how that might matter and interact with their shyness as well.
Yes, so that's also something that I think is really interesting and worth looking at, and something that I've thought a bit about, this relation between shyness and aversion to novelty, whether this really goes down deep enough to affect their response to the novel object in this task and the familiar objects, because that would also make sense in terms of what's going on with the attentional processing and their attention to the novelty on this task. I don't have any data or any studies that particularly drive me in one direction or the other, apart from to say it'd be something that's worth following up. So on the tabletop study, I think if if they've interacted with an object, even if they don't have a word for it yet or they don't have a mapping for it yet, that might then just make them comfortable enough to be able to guess that might be the referent for it in this task. So one of these studies where you have sort of super novel objects versus pre-familiarized novel objects would be one way to get at that. I think that would be really interesting. And here we stuck with the context, but I think that there's must be things going on as well at the object level that could influence that too. I don't know if you have any ideas or any leads on work that might be relevant for that.
I have some of that data, so I would love to chat with you a little more because the familiarity we know changes learning, and depending on the age, the familiarity matters differently. So I suspect there's going to be temperament differences there. And we do have the data in our data set. I just haven't looked at it yet. So we should follow up and chat.
Cool. Yeah, that would be really cool. And I found you on the screen eventually, so I can see you now. Thank you. No, I think that's really interesting, and that'd be really so these age things as well, I think is also important. So as you'll see, the sample ages that I'm testing vary slightly, which isn't as clean as it could be because this is a big age gap that we're testing across. And I can imagine that how shy children deal with their response to novelty and familiarity is changing rapidly across those ages too. So yes, thank you for the question, and we should definitely catch up.
So we have time also for more questions.
If there aren't any in the live audience, I have one from the chat. Logan from Logan DeRay. I was surprised that shyness did not seem to negatively affect looking time in the unfamiliar novel condition. How do you explain that?
I was also surprised, not upset, just surprised. One of the things I think it might be is that these children are slightly older, so I wonder if the original effects I find with attention to novelty, they've worn off a bit by this age, because that would be the only explanation I would have if this effect does exist, that it doesn't get found in this study. So I expected that I hoped we'd find a positive relation in the familiarized context, and I thought that we would find a negative relation in the unfamiliar context. The fact that we didn't, I would put down to age differences. These children are slightly older, so it's not such a negative impact of shyness on attention to the novel object. But yes, as I say, a small part of a very big puzzle that we're just trying to put together. But a nice question, and I'm glad I wasn't the only one that was surprised by that.
Okay, if there aren't any more questions, thank you again, Matt, for your talk.
Pleasure.
And I now hand over to you for showing
Yes.
session while I do the talk.
Can I just talk? So I can now introduce Nils, who's been doing a good job of chairing, so I can be temporary chair for the last session. Nils Tolksdorf is currently a fellow of the Digital Society Research Program, which is funded by the state of North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. And he works at Paderborn University with Professor Katharina Rolfing, and he's in the final year of his PhD. He's interested in the intersection of psycholinguistics and human-robot interaction, which is very cool indeed. And he's got a particular focus on language acquisition and how individual differences in children and different pragmatic demands influence children's interactive behavior and learning trajectories. So he works with social robotics and centers on multimodal design as well as an ethical and child-oriented implementation of the technology. He's also published in high-ranking interdisciplinary journals, leading conferences, and is going to talk to us today about how shyness affects children's attention during word learning and a long-term interaction with a social robot. Nils, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Matt. So, this topic may seem from a first point of view a bit further away from the rest of the topics here at this conference, but actually these new technologies such as humanoid robots are already used within learning contexts and becoming more and more integrated into our society. And additionally, they present an interesting methodological approach, which is an aspect I will come to later. So, but first of all, I would like to mention that this work is joint work together with Franziska Viertel and Katharina Rolfing. And at its base, in this talk, I will try to address 3 goals. So first, I want to present insights on how shy children's attentional patterns unfold during word learning, perfectly following up on Matt's talk here, but in more naturalistic situations. And second, and importantly, I would like to take a long-term perspective and set a focus on the role of increasing familiarity through repeated interactions on children's behavior. And the last goal in my talk is to present social robots as interaction partners for children and also address them as a possible methodological tool. So we have heard quite a bit today about the characteristics of shy children, but I would like to briefly touch on this again. So shyness describes individuals who are hesitant to participate in social interactions or individuals who are socially withdrawn, and particularly in unfamiliar or novel situations. And in this way, it becomes very prominent that when addressing the phenomenon of shyness, it is important to also look at it in different time scales, because over time, the effects of shyness can change greatly. And beyond the fact that shyness is reflected in children's behavior toward an interaction partner, shyness has also an effect on the measured learning outcomes in educational contexts. And what goes along with when it comes to language learning is that shy children were reported to perform worse in receptive and also in productive language tests, and in particular, again, in unfamiliar environments. And importantly, however, it is proposed that the differences in language ability in shy children are not genuine and should disappear under conditions which minimize anxiety or fear of evaluation. So this is based on the assumption that the test situation per se and the feeling of social evaluation inhibits shy children, in particular from demonstrating their knowledge. And in this regard, we found recently that when shy children become more familiar with a testing situation and become more experienced with the structure of the test situation and the demands within the situation, they can close the gap with less shy children in the test scores. So when taking, however, a more in-depth look at the actual process when children are exposed to a novel word, recent work suggests that one reason for the lower measured learning outcomes of shy children may not only be their inhibited behavior in a test situation, but that shy children might be characterized by a different visual attentional pattern. And this may lead also to lower retention performances. And here, as Matt already presented, Hilton and colleagues found evidence that shyness can reduce children's visual attention to new and familiar objects in a single word learning task. So the authors speculated here that shy children's aversion to novelty disrupts ongoing attentional processes, and their reduced attention to objects during the labeling could mean that more shy children require more exposure to a novel object label pairing. So this could also be one explanation why repetitive structures and increasing familiarity are especially helpful for more shy children. And beyond that, this work conforms with findings showing that also in naturalistic interactions, attention to the target object is related to successful word retrieval. So overall, there's little question that children's time spent in focused attention translates into superior learning and retention of new information throughout development and across domains. So to sum it up in a first step, familiarity with a situation strongly influences shy children's behavior, and shy children's relative underachievements in test situations might disappear once they were familiarized with the procedure and the demands of the test situation. In addition, we know from previous work examining children's attentional behavior within a single session that shy children exhibit a deviant behavior in their attention. So, however, so far it is unknown or unclear how children's attentional patterns develop over time with increasing familiarity and within interactions with a social interaction partner. So to step back here for a moment, and before we get into the details of our study, and since we also conduct our study with a social robot as a child's interaction partner, I would like to talk briefly about social robots in current educational contexts. So first of all, currently in education there are mainly two different ways to use social robots. For example, when used in, I think the PowerPoint crashed here. Just restarting it. Okay, here we go. So hopefully it now works. So one area is to use robots in learning domains such as computational education or computer education. And here the robot has more a passive role, and the aim is to learn something about the robot. So for example, how to program it. And the other way is, sorry, yes, again a problem. And the other way is to use social robots more as a peer or co-learner, so also in different social roles in domains such as language learning. And here they have a more active role and serve as an interaction partner to learn from and with. So to give you a further impression of different kinds of so-called social robots, here are some examples that are used in child-robot interaction studies. And social robots share physical spaces with humans and leverage human means of communicating, such as speech, movement, and nonverbal clues, including gestures, gaze, or even facial expressions, in order to interface with us in more natural ways. So social robots really allow us to embed the learning process into social interaction using multimodal communicative strategies. And if we look briefly at the potentials of social robots, we know that children treat a social robot as a trustworthy and knowledgeable interaction partner from whom they could seek information. And they also conform with what robots suggest, so informatively and normatively. And probably the most important aspect is that they allow engagement with the physical world, so they can perform actions through their body and through their physical presence. And if we look separately at the area of using social robots for language learning, or word learning, research shows that children can learn new words from a robot and increase their vocabulary, and also other domains of language learning can be supported with social robots, such as narrative skills of children. So to get taken together in a second step, we know that social robots can be used to improve learning performances and have the potential to provide a way to systematically change interaction and engage children through their physical presence. And therefore, social robots also offer a methodological tool to precisely design an interaction and evaluate its effects. However, one thing to mention here is that due to technical limitations, often the robot is partly or fully teleoperated. So, for example, autonomous social robot that interactionally acts appropriate usually does not work that well because of its simply too unreliable speech recognition. So coming back to our study now and facing the mentioned aspects, we wanted to explore in our study how shyness is reflected in children's attentional behavior over repeated interactions within an interaction with a social robot. And given that familiarity with a situation has a strong influence on shyness, and in light of prior work in our exploratory study, we ventured the assumption that children's attention to target objects would be lower at the beginning of the long-term interaction compared to less shy children, and increase with familiarity over the repeated interactions. And therefore, in our study, we analyzed data from a child-robot study consisting longitudinal design of 4 sessions over 2 weeks. And in this long-term interaction, we taught 28 4 to 5-year-old preschool children novel words in an unambiguous labeling context, and children were engaged in a joint task with a robot, in which the robot taught the children 6 new color words in this case. And looking closer at the sequential structure of the learning situations that took place in session 1, 2, and 3, our goal was here to systematically provide the children with an interactive structure in which the new words served a specific purpose and the interaction partners fulfilled a specific role in the dialogue. And in this context, the children could accumulate experience with regard to the interactional structure and the whole communicative event. And we embedded the learning situation as a whole in a narrative that was told to the children by the robot. And here you can also see the sequential structure of the training situation, learning situation, which the children experienced 3 times during session 1 to 3. And in our analysis, and importantly in the way how we captured children's attentional patterns, we were interested precisely in children's gaze behavior during the phase when the robot labeled the objects. Specifically, we captured the following gaze behavior of the children. So first, children's gaze to the referent that was labeled. So basically, the continuity between hearing the new word or talking about the new word and attending to its intended referent. And second, children's gaze to the other reference that were basically the competitors of the item that was labeled. And third, as we had in this, oh, now it crashed again, so that is unexpected. But we become more familiar to that. So, sorry for this technical problem here. Luckily, the program followed the prior talks. So as we had in this paradigm a social interaction partner of the child, we lastly coded also children's looking to the robot in this situation. And as the children learned 6 new words, we had 6 labeling episodes per child in each of the 3 sessions. So a total of 18 labeling episodes per child that were analyzed across the entire long-term interaction. And finally, in the 3rd and 4th session, we tested children's ability to produce the learned words, and the structure of the test situation was similarly structured and took place in the frame of a joint book reading situation. And we also use this format because it represents a routinized activity for children of that age. It has also been shown to be applicable in child affection studies. And during this situation, the child was asked to turn the pages while the robot talked about the pictures and elicited the trained words. Finally, for measuring the degree of shyness of the children, we used a standardized questionnaire that measures temperament. And the assessment allows a nuanced classification from not at all shy to extremely shy, according to age and gender. And according with the evaluation procedure, we grouped our sample into 3 levels of shyness. So low shy children, moderately shy children, and high shy children. So finally, coming to our results, the following picture appears. First, in the first step, we performed a group comparison, and you can see here in each shyness group in one of the boxes, and within each box we see in light blue on the left the first session, in blue the second session, and in dark blue the third session. And on the y-axis we see the proportion of time looking to the labeled referent during the labeling episodes. And as you can see, we found an overall significant effect of time here, and in each group visual attention to the labeled reference decreased significantly after the first session. And interestingly, our data did not provide indication for a significant difference between the groups, reflecting the different degrees of shyness. So in this labeling context and in all the learning situations, we found no significant differences between the more shy children and the less shy children. Interestingly, with regard to children's attention to the other reference, so the competitors of the item that was labeled, we found no differences between the groups in the first 2 sessions, but in the long term, so in the third session, we discovered an effect and found that shyer children showed significantly longer to the overall items presented. And here it appeared that the highly shy children spent more time looking to the other reference than the moderately shy children, and the latter in turn spent more time than the less shy children. And finally, the group comparison with regard to children's attention to the social interaction partner in this task revealed that attention to the robot dropped significantly in the high shy children in the third session. And beyond that, we also found again that in the long term, also in the third session, high shy children differed from the low shy children in the amount of attention to the social robot and displayed significantly less attention here. Okay, in our second step of our analysis and beyond the group comparisons, we examined the relations of attentional patterns and word learning outcomes of the children. So we ran a multiple regression model and found a predictive relation between the mean proportion of attention to the labeled referent throughout the 3 learning sessions and word learning outcomes in the delayed post-test in session 4. So meaning the higher the children's mean proportional attention to the labeled reference, the greater was the success in word learning. And interestingly, here we've found no moderation effect for shyness. So we found no association between children's shyness scores and the word learning outcomes. And beyond that, there were no relations observable that occurred in the immediate post-test in session 3. But only in the long term we found these relations. So to conclude, here we investigated in our study how shy preschoolers' attentional patterns unfold during a long-term word learning task with a social robot and how their behavior developed in comparison to less shy children. And in contrast to our initial assumption, we found no differences between shyness groups in their attentional patterns to the labeled reference in our analyzed setting. However, it's important to note here that in our study the children were older and compared to prior studies, and importantly, the children fulfilled a different communicative role in our design. So they were engaged in social interaction within a joint task, and they also the type of labeling context, meaning the embedding in a narrative and the context of labeling pictures represents a more familiar format for children. And interestingly, we found that high shy children looked longer to references that are not referred to at session 3. So this could be explained with that shy children reassure themselves more often, even after they become more familiar with the situation. And finally, it is worth to note that the mean proportion of attention to labeled reference, but not solely the attention to a labeled reference, predicted long-term word learning in our data. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to answer your questions or hear your comments.
Thank you very much for a really nice talk. I would open the floor to questions from the live audience, which has grown since I left the stage. Or maybe Franziska has something on the online chat, but in the meantime, maybe I could ask a first question about so the shyness and children looking at the robot. Could you just run me through those effects again? So the looking towards the robot during the labeling, was shyness predicting that or not?
Sorry, so you mean if shyness predicted the attention during
to the robot itself? Yeah.
So that was not in our focus analysis. So that would be probably something interesting we could also look again. But we also only focus in this study on the relations to the word learning success, so the outcomes and the attentional. The mean attention to the reference, yeah.
But do you have a feeling for if there was something going on with the shyer kids and what they're doing with the robot, with the presence of the robot?
Yeah, so going back to this slide, so we see, so one observation, but it's only speculation, was that, the shyer children were more really concentrated to the task. So looking at the pictures, and while the not shy at all children really discovered the robot in the first place, in the first session, the second session, and really also touched the robot and really addressed the robot very often. This faded away, so in the last session. So maybe the novelty effect of the robot declined a little bit in the low shy children and moderately shy children, and so maybe this difference then appeared here. Yeah.
And would it be possible to manipulate how the robot is then interacting with the child? So could you make, for example, a robot be very empathetic and step back and give the child a breather, and then maybe have an annoying robot that keeps asking and pushing the child? Would that be something that would be worth? Can you do that with the robot?
Yeah, so that would be interesting and would be possible. So of course we pre-programmed every single cue in this situation of the robot. So also in this setting, the robot used different communicative signals, like pointing to the target object or explicitly visually addressing the child. It would be an interesting question if children also perceive such difference in the artificial interaction partner, and how this what picture would be then drawn. But yeah, would be interesting, but we haven't done it. So in this situation, the robot acted exactly the same. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Have any questions opened up online, Franziska?
No, not yet.
Okay. And Franziska, do you have any comments to add? Because I think you're on the paper too.
No, it's kind of awkward to pose some questions to my colleague.
No, okay. I just wanted you to be involved, and you are, so goal achieved. Cool. I'm not comfortable with being the chair at this point now, Niels. What's my role?
Yeah, so I can take.
So thank you, Niels. Applause for Niels again. Thank you for a wonderful talk and a good question.
Yeah, thank you very much. So that would mean we are at the end of our symposium. I hope you found the aspects presented as enlightening as I did. And thank you to all the speakers that participated in this talk. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Kristie, for your wonderful presentations. And yeah, I think in the future that we're seeing many pathways and promising future research directions in this symposium. And then I would say we close this symposium, and I wish you all a very interesting remaining conference, and thank you for attending to this symposium also in the online space, and yeah, have a nice remaining conference.
Bye.